Hello, Eugene Aiello here. To this video, we're going to be talking about quantum mechanics as it relates to quantum biology. This entire series basically is a series about quantum biology, discoveries of how quantum interactions at the biologic level govern all interactions within physiology of life. Most importantly, the focus of this video series has been how biophotonic energy is actually the driving force. That's what's creating the quantum interactions. Without electromagnetic energy interacting with electrons within biologic proteins or biologic molecules in general, there would be no life, there would be no activity. So I'm going to start this video out with a quote. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner in physics in 1965, famously said, "If you think you understand quantum mechanics, that means you don't understand it at all." So that kind of takes a lot of weight off my chest here on this video, because if I start to act like I understand any of this, that means I'm leading you astray. Quantum physics is something that's very difficult for us to understand because our whole way of evaluating reality, what we perceive around us, does not allow for what quantum physics describes. Quantum physics describes everything as massless. Things have either mass or they can be massless. So in the quantum state, you can alternate between the two states. So we're going to get into that. So I'm going to start off first by describing classic physics. Classic physics is what we're all used to. That's what we've all learned. All the different equations of predictability of behavior of mass. So classic physics, predictable behavior of mass and wave energy on a macro scale. So at the scale that we are perceiving the world, classic physics fits in. We can predict how the physical world is going to act. So if we have a bowling ball at the top of a hill, we can predict with classic physics based on the weight, the slope of the hill, the friction of the hill, what the speed and momentum is going to be. We can also predict that if that bowling ball does not have enough momentum to break through a wall, it's going to stop when it hits that wall. It's going to have an action, reaction, bounce back. Okay, so very predictable. Quantum physics, unpredictable at the micro scale. So when it gets very small, when we get down to small particles such as electrons and photons and protons and neutrons, but most interactions we're going to talk about in quantum interactions in biology are going to be electrons and photons. They behave as a massless wave energy at the same time they behave like mass. So if we're taking it on a little diagram I made here, it's kind of small. So in classic physics, everything has a mass. If you get into quantum physics, electrons, they'll have a wave property. But here's where things get very interesting. When there's an observer, we have a situation that is referred to as objective collapse, meaning that these wave energies will exist as a massless object, massless phenomena, but as soon as it's observed by an observer, it collapses. It goes down into mass. So kind of a crazy concept. It kind of goes of that whole tree in the forest falls, does it make a sound? That doesn't fit for this, but the concept of an observer is actually what's creating reality. In a little bit, I'm going to do a little diagram I find fun. But an observer could even be a protein. So a protein that has a way of measuring the surrounding, meaning a lot of proteins will have a hydrophobic core where they'll have all these different ring structures with the pi electrons, but they'll also have these carbon chains that are just completely saturated with hydrogen. Those are measuring the surrounding, very much so like an antenna would. So if a protein interacts with its surrounding, it's also going to collapse a quantum wave energy into a mass. So, like I said a minute ago, if you understand this, you don't understand it. So life is the interaction of quantum mechanics within biologic proteins. Light is the energy driving quantum actions within the proteins. So basically, we're having electromagnetic energy, which photonic energy, photons at the tip of a wave particle of light, there is no mass. But when that mass interacts with an electron, it imparts energy into that electron that's exciting that electron. Those excitations of electrons are creating the quantum, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, the different quantum interactions I've been mentioning within proteins, the cytochromes, that quantum interaction where that electron gets donated to oxygen. I've talked enough that I've said non-ionizing radiation does not have enough energy to bump that electron off of that biologic molecule. So when we're talking about a cytochrome donating that electron to oxygen, it doesn't make a lot of sense with what I've said so far. As you're going to learn in a little bit, quantum tunneling is one of the characteristics that is exhibited in the quantum realm of quantum physics realm, where that electron, it gets excited in that orbital, but it's only getting into that oxygen, it's transferring over, because that barrier that needs to be overcome can be overcome if that electron moves into a wave particle. So the electron leaves that mass state and becomes a wave particle for a brief period of time. It can cross a barrier. So we're going to get into that next. Not next. I still got a little more to talk about. Quantum realism is going to be fun. I want to reset up my board and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm going to start with another quote here. Had to grab my book for this one. A quote by Bruce Lipton. He was a developmental biologist that did quite a bit of interesting work with stem cells. I talk about it in my book. I don't want to get into it in this video because we're not talking about stem cells. What quantum physics teaches us is that everything we thought was physical is not physical. So everything we perceive, when I'm sure at some point you've learned in science class or professionals out there that when you're looking at a chair that there's really nothing to that chair. That chair is only existing because at that moment all those different particles, which also are mostly empty space, appear as a physical reality to us, when in reality it's not. So quantum realism talks about this. There's two parts to quantum realism. At the quantum level, everything is massless with infinite possibilities of location and time. I mentioned earlier, just briefly, Young's experiment with the double slit experiment. What his experiment was is he produced a setup where he had small slits in a barrier and then another barrier behind where he could measure those photons hitting the barrier. When he was shining a photon of light through that, he started noticing different patterns he expected. One of the things he didn't expect was he actually observed that a photon went through the slit, both slits simultaneously. Again, to us, that makes absolutely no sense. When we're looking at things from our mindset of the world, which is through our binary nervous system, we can't conceive that something could be in two places at the same time. But when we're looking at, when I was talking earlier about quantum computers versus binary computers, that our quantum system within that glial cell has infinite possibilities of calculations and probabilities, where the binary system is an on and off. There's two aspects to it. So in this wave function, binary would be the peak of the wave, the bottom of the wave, 1 and 0. With quantum realism in the double slit concept, you could actually be 1, 0, anything in between, but you can also be 1 and 0 simultaneously. So when we get into that concept that I think I briefly mentioned it, and it's in detail in my book, that when you're calculating with quantum computers, you have a vast amount of probabilities that could be exhibited within that system. That is exactly how this quantum system is working within the glial cell system. It's not just zeros and ones, but it's any probability, but at the same time, it's invisible. It's acting as a wave particle, a massless infinite possibilities. So the second part of quantum realism, when an observer is present, the quantum energy collapses into mass for a brief moment in time. I mentioned that a minute ago. So if you've got an electron traveling through as a wave particle, when it's observed either by, we like to think of it as our eye, as an observer is us, or even interactions within the cell by proteins, that's going to collapse that into physical reality. So we're going to, in the next section, talk about that, the different fractal levels of how everything is interacting from beginning a quantum level, which is actually nothing, just wave energy, but different interactions of observation of that quantum energy is creating, in a very brief period in time, a mass. So I like to think of it as when something is observing it, this is a very high frequency energy. When it gets observed, it's lowering that frequency of energy, almost like the observer is absorbing that quantum energy just in the act of observation, and it's slowing that particle down to be observed in the physical realm. So I'm going to rechange my board again because we have a lot to go over, and it's simpler just to keep on doing it and not cram it all together in one little small area.